Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling a fascinating economic puzzle that literally affects everything from the price of your morning commute to the global balance of trade. We're looking at the Indian rupee, specifically its depreciation against the US dollar. Now you know the drill. Whenever the rupee drops in value, the immediate public reaction is just pure panic. Headlines scream crisis, and it's almost always viewed as a sure sign of economic weakness. But what if I told you that a falling currency isn't always the disaster everyone thinks it is? In fact, under the right conditions, it can actually be a highly strategic economic tool. We're going to break down this perceived problem and transform it into a clear economic reality.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the 100 rupee question, understand the mechanics of currency depreciation, and look at how weakness can actually act as a strength. Then, we'll balance that out with the dangers of falling value, dig into the economic theories behind it all, and finally compare controlled versus uncontrolled depreciation.
All right, Section 1, the 100 rupee question. Every single time the rupee edges closer to a new low against the dollar, public anxiety just spikes. But former Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, Arvind Panagariya, offers this incredibly counterintuitive narrative. He recently stated that policymakers absolutely should not panic if the rupee approaches or even crosses the 100 per dollar mark. As he put it, 100 is just a number. His core argument here is that governments shouldn't be burning through their hard-earned foreign exchange reserves just to defend a completely psychological, arbitrary exchange rate level. According to him, allowing a gradual, market-based depreciation might actually be way healthier for the economy than artificially propping the currency up.
Which brings us to Section 2, understanding currency depreciation. Before we can judge if this is good or bad, let's look at the actual mechanics. Imagine that earlier, $1 cost 83 rupees. Now it shifts so that $1 costs 96 rupees. Depreciation simply means that Indians now need to spend more rupees to buy one single $. And at first glance, yeah, this seems universally bad, right? Imported stuff becomes way more expensive. But in macroeconomics, effects are rarely just universally positive or negative. The impact depends entirely on the structure of the economy, how strong your exports are, and the global conditions of play.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds, when weakness becomes a strength.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of the financial benefit for certain sectors. Consider an Indian IT firm that earns $10 million annually from its overseas clients. When the exchange rate was 83 rupees to the dollar, that 10 million converted to 830 million rupees in revenue. But if the exchange rate moves to 96 rupees to the dollar, that exact same 10 million in revenue suddenly becomes 960 million rupees. Boom! That is a massive jump in domestic revenue, and they didn't have to sell a single extra line of code to get it. The shift in the exchange rate alone delivers that windfall.
So who exactly wins when the currency drops? Well, it's a pretty specific group. First up, as we just saw, software and IT services, along with business process outsourcing, reap huge rewards because they get paid in foreign currency. Second, general exporters win big. Think about it. If an Indian software service cost $100 for a foreign buyer when the rate was 83, at a rate of 96, that same service now costs the foreign buyer only about $86. Indian products instantly become cheaper and highly competitive internationally. Third, domestic manufacturing gets a serious boost. Because imports become more expensive, locals start buying locally produced goods instead, which perfectly aligns with policies like Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat. And finally, tourism. A tourist bringing in $1,000 used to get 83,000 rupees, now they get 96,000. India becomes a much more attractive, affordable destination, boosting hotels, transport, and local employment across the board.
But of course, we have to look at Section 4, the dangers of falling value.
We really have to balance the scales here, because the public anxiety is completely valid. If you're importing goods, a weak currency is painful. India imports massive quantities of crude oil, electronics, machinery, and gold. When you need more rupees to buy dollars, the cost of all those essentials absolutely skyrockets. And that leads directly to our second point, imported inflation. When crude oil gets more expensive, petrol and diesel prices rise. When fuel rises, the cost of transporting food rises, and that hits consumers directly at the grocery store. Then there's foreign debt. Imagine a company has a $1 billion loan. At 83 rupees to the dollar, they owe 83 billion rupees. At 96, their debt inflates to 96 billion rupees literally overnight. Finally, excessive, uncontrolled depreciation can really spook foreign investors, causing them to withdraw capital and flee to safer markets.
So how do we make sense of this? Let's jump to Section 5, Economic Theories of Depreciation.
Let's elevate this from a simple pros and cons list.
What is the global macroeconomic science actually saying? Some of the greatest economic minds have historically argued in favor of weaker currencies under the right conditions. John Maynard Keynes, the father of Keynesian economics, argued that a weaker currency makes exports cheaper, which increases foreign demand, ramps up domestic factory production, and ultimately stimulates employment. Classical mercantilist thinkers believe that national wealth actually comes from trade surpluses, exporting more than you import, and a weak currency naturally helps achieve exactly that. Even Nobel laureate Paul Krugman has emphasized that artificially overvalued currencies actually hurt a nation simply because they make domestic industries lose their competitive edge on the global stage.
And this brilliantly illustrates a crucial concept known as the Marshall-Lerner condition. Economists Alfred Marshall and Abba Lerner theorized that a currency drop will actually improve a country's overall trade balance, but only if a specific mathematical condition is met. The combined responsiveness, or elasticity, of exports and imports has to be greater than 1. What does that mean in plain English? It means that if a cheaper rupee causes foreign buyers to significantly increase their orders for Indian software, pharmaceuticals, and engineering goods, while simultaneously causing Indians to cut back on expensive imports, the country's economic position actually gets stronger, not weaker.
This flows right into the famous J-curve effect, which maps out how this transition actually feels in real time. If you chart the trade balance on a graph after a currency depreciates, it looks exactly like the letter J. First, there's a sudden dip. Import bills rise immediately because the oil and goods you are already committed to buying suddenly cost more. That is the bottom of the J, and honestly, it's usually the moment consumers are the unhappiest. When you're waiting for that long-term economic payoff but still paying those high gas prices? But then, given time, the export sectors adjust to their new competitive prices. Foreign orders roll in and production expands. The line on the graph sweeps upward, revealing long-term economic benefits. Historically, export powerhouses like China and South Korea experienced this exact J-curve phenomenon during their periods of rapid economic transformation. Basically, things often look worse mathematically before they improve.
All right, bringing it all together in Section 6, controlled versus uncontrolled depreciation.
To deliver a final verdict, we have to look at the broader context of the Indian economy today, and it gives us some mixed signals. On one hand, there are really strong positive factors. Expectations of robust GDP growth, relatively manageable inflation compared to historic crises, massive foreign exchange reserves, and incredible strength in service exports. However, there are undeniable negative factors to balance this out: an incredibly high dependence on imported oil, rising geopolitical uncertainties globally, and the inherent risks of currency volatility. A currency is neither inherently good nor bad. It is simply a tool whose impact depends entirely on this specific context.
So the crucial point here is moderation. A moderate, market-driven depreciation preserves reserves and genuinely helps exporters. It encourages local manufacturing, and most importantly, it means the central bank isn't burning billions of dollars just to defend a symbolic number like 100. But a rapid, uncontrolled collapse? No way. That is where the pain of severe imported inflation and totally unmanageable foreign debt quickly takes over, far outweighing any benefits to those exporters.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly critical thought. The real issue, the real test for policymakers and citizens alike, is not actually whether the rupee falls from 96 to 100 or beyond. The real question is the underlying economy strong enough to manage the consequences of that movement? Because if the fundamentals are strong, a falling currency might just transform from a perceived national crisis into a brilliant strategic economic advantage. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.